back. Thanks for sticking with us this morning. You know, we just covered 3 other very, very important topics today. I got to tell you guys, I'm the alarm bells should be ringing everywhere in everyone's mind. The smell of fire isn't just a scent on the wind anymore. It's so close you can feel the heat on your skin. There's an article in the Daily Caller. I'll link this at the bottom of this YouTube video in the comments, the subject section. I want you to take a look at this article today. It's important that you read it. There's a writer for the Washington Times. Now, the Washington Times is not the Washington Post. And, you know, they are not a mouthpiece for the administration like the Washington Post. This woman is an investigative journalist, and she's done a lot of articles on a whole series, basically, I should say, of articles on the Marshals, the Air Marshals Service, on 2 specific issues. One, that the Air Marshals Service were misrepresenting, lying about how many flights they were actually on. They recorded that they had been on and monitored more flights than there actually were. I don't know quite what the motivation was for that, other than the fact that they get paid for stuff they're not doing. But there's other aspects to this too. And the second aspect of this, or element to this Air Marshal Service story she broke, is that the Air Marshals have been, and the government in general, have been keeping quiet the fact that there have been dry runs by terrorists on airplanes, and they know it for a fact. And they're keeping that information from America because they don't want America and the flying public and the corporate world to panic, thinking another 9/11 is imminent. This woman's name is Audrey Hudson. So she did this interview with the Daily Caller. What happened was her home was raided by federal and state agents, including the Department of Homeland Security. I'll get into that in a minute. And what they took while they were there, they went under the pretext that her husband had a charge in 1986. He'd pled guilty in 1986 to resisting arrest. Okay? I don't know what the circumstances of it, and I don't even care. It doesn't matter. Because they used that as the pretext to say she had firearms in her home. And he can't be in proximity of firearms. And they're contemplating whether or not they're going to charge him with possession of a firearm as a prohibited person. Look it up. It's called 922G. Title 18, U.S. Code. Title 18, 922G. Possession of a firearm by a prohibited person. Now, they got a warrant, and they raided her home. And it was Department of Homeland Security and Maryland State Police that were involved in the pre-dawn raid. Okay, now this happened back on August 6th. She's a former Washington Times reporter, and she now is, she's a freelance writer. She submits her stories to any paper that will buy them and take them. The search warrant was obtained, and it by the Daily Caller, and it indicates that the August raid allowed law enforcement to search for firearms inside the home, based on the predicated argument that her husband's a felon, and therefore, and if you don't know the rules of felons, by the way, and I am one, so I know the rules. You can't have a firearm in the same premise that you live in. So it doesn't just limit my Second Amendment right to own a firearm. It also bars my family from ever having a firearm because no one in the premise is allowed to be in possession of a firearm. And if they are, then I am construed to be in, quote, constructive possession. and I can go back to prison for that. That's a whole different topic for a whole nother show. I've covered it before. If this is news to you because you're a new listener, that's the deal. I did 3 years for an ATF setup on me for the same nonsense. Why I'm so angry about what's going on around us? Because I see, and I've seen the underside of this dragon from the inside close up. It's evil. Biblical evil. The search warrant states that they can go and look for firearms based on this 1986 resisting arrest guilty plea from this guy. Okay? It authorizes and gives the police permission to search the residence that they share together and to seize all weapons and ammunition because he's prohibited under the law from possessing firearms. Okay. The way the law works is that if law enforcement is there with a search warrant, and that search warrant says you can obtain and you can seize the following items, and it lists and outlines exactly what they can take and can't take. And they're not allowed to take anything that's not listed there unless that item happens to be something that is in open, visible access, and it's also illegal. So the example would be a drug, right? So they go into your home for a search warrant for, let's assume for argument's sake, they went into this woman's home with a search warrant for guns, and while they were there, they found a bag of heroin or something. They have the right to seize that and charge her with it because that's incidental, but it happened to be an illegal thing that they found. But they're not allowed to take anything else that is not illegal for her to possess. And what they actually took was a batch of documents that contained information, including the whistleblower sources inside the Department of Homeland Security and Transportation Security, TSA. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is who was conducting the raid. And they took the evidence from her that had the names of the whistleblowers inside the Department of Homeland Security. She's been silent up until now. You know why she's speaking out now? Because she's trying to tell these people, hey, you've been uncovered. She shows a photo in the article, and that's why I want you to see it. It's on thedailycaller.com. I'll put a link right in the bottom of this YouTube channel, but if you're finding this video somewhere else, you can go to the Daily Caller and just type in Feds confiscate investigative reporters' confidential files. And she shows a picture of these files that are in these, cardboard file folders, and they're in an evidence bag. So wait, the story gets even better, guys. They state that they did that because they wanted to determine whether or not she had a right to have them. Well, first of all, the search warrant doesn't authorize them to take anything but guns. So right off the bat, they have no right to take it, and they know it. If they don't know the rules of a search warrant, then they have no right or duty submitting one and executing one. If you are a law enforcement and you don't know the rules of evidence, then you don't belong in the raid party. On Thursday, a spokesman for the Maryland State Police declined to address any specifics about the search. Here's what their quote was. Due to the ongoing criminal investigation and the potential for pending criminal charges at the state and or federal level, the Maryland State Police will not discuss specific information about this investigation at this time. Greg Shipley, spokesperson. At 4:30 in the morning, listen to the timing, 4:30 a.m., on August 6th, a bunch of officers came up to her in full body armor, and they went and banged on her door, and they presented the search warrant. They entered the house, 7 officers in full body armor, to confiscate alleged weapons. After the search began, Hudson was asked by one of the investigators for the Coast Guard Investigative Service, who was part of the raid team, and she explains why the Coast Guard was there, because they have something to do with the ex-Coast Guard or something, and so they were automatically as part of the raid team. But she was asked by the investigator with the Coast Guard Investigative Service if she was the same Audrey Hudson who had written a series of critical stories about air marshals for the Washington Times over the last decade. Wow. Talk about telegraphing your punch. The Coast Guard operates under Homeland Security, by the way, because Homeland Security now owns, all law enforcement, all military, domestic military organizations, including the Coast Guard and stuff, and so forth and so on. The investigator, Miguel Bosch, identified himself as, guess what? A former air marshal. Wow. Talk about, what a coincidence, right? All these coincidences are happening during this one raid. It wasn't until a month later, on September 10th, that Hudson, the woman, was informed by Bosch, Miguel Bosch, who was the former air marshal, who specifically questioned her about whether or not she was the author of these air marshal stories published in the Washington Post that were not nice to the air marshal service, right? And it wasn't until a month later that Hudson was informed by Miguel Bosch that the 5 files that included her handwritten and her typed notes from interviews with numerous confidential sources and other documents had been taken. The files that were included were used to expose, and this is the quote from Hudson, the woman. In particular, the files included notes that were used to expose how the Federal Air Marshal Service had lied to Congress about the number of airline flights that were actually protecting against another terrorist attack. Furthermore, they lied to Congress not only about how many flights they'd been on, but other issues as well. There were actually apparently more flights, or they claimed to be on more flights than there were. Well, when they told her that they had these files and that they had confiscated them, and she didn't know it. Don't forget now, she wrote these over the last decade, so it's probably not files that she had, right out handy sitting on her desk because she was writing stories with them every day. These are files that were either in a cabinet or put away somewhere. She said she asked Bosch why they took the files. Miguel Bosch now, the ex-air marshal working for Department of Homeland Security, right? He responded that they needed to run them by TSA to make sure it was, quote, legitimate for her to have them. Legitimate for me to have my own notes? That's her quote back. There were, asked how many sources that she had in the files, she said a lot, more than one. There were a lot of names in those files. The guy basically came in here and took my anonymous sources and turned them over, took my whistleblowers and turned it over to the agency they were blowing the whistle on. The Daily Caller reached this guy, Miguel Bosch, by phone on Thursday, and they asked if they could interview him, and he said, before I talk to you, I'm probably going to have to run this by our legal department. Standard operating procedure, right? Block. Media relations guy for the Coast Guard said in a statement that they won't they won't discuss it because they participated in the raid because the search involved a Coast Guard employee, and but they won't discuss it because it's under investigation and blah 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 blah. Carlos Diaz, the chief of media relations for the Coast Guard, says that they took the files because they found official government papers. And they had a question as to whether or not she had a right to have them. Guess what? The papers that she had were obtained through a Freedom of Information Act, which anyone can get simply by filing the request. Diaz says this is his quote. During the course of the search, the Coast Guard Information Service discovered government documents labeled FOUO. for official use only, and LES, law enforcement sensitive. They were stamped, right? The files that contain those documents were cataloged on the search warrant inventory and taken from the premises. The documents were reviewed with the source agency, and determined to be obtained properly through the Freedom of Information Act. They then returned the documents after making them sign for them. Here's what Hudson has to say. That explains the one file they took, but does not explain why they took 4 other files with my handwritten and typed interview notes with confidential sources that I staked my reputation as a journalist to protect under the auspices of the First Amendment of the Constitution. In February, 4 months before the raid, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had approached her and wanted to talk about a purchase that her husband had made, or she had made, 5 years ago. The ATF investigators asked her if her husband Flanagan had obtained a possible machine gun part from a Swedish national. A machine gun part. Her husband responded that he had once purchased a potato gun, but he threw it away because he couldn't make it work. Now, one part, their argument is that the guy is in possession of guns even though he's a prohibited ex-felon, right? And so in July, according to the documents, Miguel Bosch, the ex-air marshal guy who specifically questioned her about whether or not she was the author of the air marshal stories that were negative about the air marshal service, which, by the way, why does that have any bearing whatsoever on this whole issue, unless he was there specifically to find out what she knew and who the confidential sources were that she had, right? In July, Bosch interviewed a group of the Coast Guard colleagues who were friends of her husband named Flanagan. He was a Coast Guard employee. And they said that Flanagan often spoke about being a firearm collector. The court documents say, this is a quote from somebody, one party that was interviewed remembered distinctly about Flanagan advising he had recently purchased a Bersa 380 handgun and observed pictures of firearms similar to an AK-47 semi-automatic rifle, which were identified by Flanagan as being his. So this is what they went as the evidence to the court to get the warrant, right? The document notes that Victor Hodgen, the trooper, he was the state trooper from Maryland, in the Criminal Investigation Division of the Maryland State Police, accessed Flanagan's Facebook account in his investigation. So he went to Facebook and he said, hey, we got a guy here we suspect of, being a felon in possession. Well, they don't have to tell Facebook why, but they basically go to Facebook with a warrant and they say, we want a copy of the guy's entire Facebook record. We want to know everybody he communicates with, every message he sent, every email he's gotten, blah, 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 blah. Facebook complies and says, here, you got a warrant, here you go. Records maintained by Facebook will allow him to further implicate Paul Roland Flanagan in the illegal possession of firearms. And this is from the Maryland State Police. He wouldn't return a phone call left for him. The evidence and the information developed during this investigation is under review by the County State Attorney's Office and the United States Attorney's Office for determination by the officials in these offices regarding state and or federal charges that may be placed as a result of the investigation. Here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. All of this story notwithstanding, here's the problem. Hudson reported extensively on the Air Marshal program, specifically in her articles about whether Homeland Security officials lied to Congress and reported protecting more flights than they really were, and used her sources inside the government. She also reported about possible terrorist dry runs on airplanes. Now, if you're not a follower of the news on a routine basis, there has been an awful lot out in the last month or two about how terrorists have been making dry runs. And she's been writing about this stuff 10 years ago, right? In the last month, there's been a whole group of stories that have come out about how terrorists have been making dry runs on airplanes, trying to And there's nothing that they can do about it. I mean, these air marshals recognize them for what they are, but they can't prove anything. And these people are doing dry runs to prep up to do another terrorist 9/11, if you will. Unlike some other reporters whose sources have been targeted in recent years by the government, Hudson said none of the information she had was classified, nor was it given to her by anyone who had broken the law. Okay. Her final comment is, the reason I'm coming forward with this is I'm scared to contact the sources. I'm terrified to contact them, but I've got to let these guys know somehow that they've been unmasked. Okay. Now that you know the story, I'm going to wrap this up with the following concept. It's time for America to recognize what's going on here. This is nothing more than a fishing expedition to identify and find and prosecute and persecute a whistleblower and the press and media outlet that those whistleblowers use to get the word out. This administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than all previous administrations combined, number one. Number two, we know for a fact that they are adamant and out to get anybody and everybody who would even be remotely construed as a whistleblower. We know that they have absolutely zero respect for the First Amendment because they tapped the Associated Press's phones. They tapped Rosen, whatever the heck his name is, from Fox News. We know that they are punishing and prosecuting and persecuting different reporters who work in the journalism arena. Anybody who's not a sycophantic, bootlicking mouthpiece for the administration is subject to being penalized or prosecuted or persecuted. What I'm trying to tell you, America, is this. If you don't look at this in conjunction with all the other things that are happening, get yourself off the ground and get up to the 3,000-foot level and look at what's going on around you. And the map is clear. We are living in a police state. We live in a police state. It's not overt. They're not kicking in doors, one door after another as they go down the city street yet. But don't you see what's happening around you? Whistleblowers are persecuted and prosecuted. Prosecuted. Listen, they are constitutionally protected to come out and say when government is doing something illegal, they have an obligation and a duty under their sworn oath to reveal that information and allow the public to know so that it can be stopped. This administration is prosecuting them. I'm telling you, folks, this has gotten to the point where if you refuse to see what's happening around us, I just don't. I mean, look, you've heard the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, we don't have to smell the smoke anymore. We don't have to look at it. We don't even have to see the fire. It's so close to us at this point that you can feel it. If you're not willing to pay attention, if you're not willing to stand up, if you're not willing to speak out, I don't know what else to say to you. I don't know I don't know what to say to impress upon you the importance of this issue. I can give you a phrase that sums it all up rather eloquently. It's not mine. It was given to us by a guy who was much smarter and an even greater lover of this nation than even I am. His name was Sam Adams. Most Americans know him for beer. But the truth is, he was a patriot. He was a guy who worked very, very hard to make sure that this nation was a nation of liberty and freedom. And here's what he said. If you love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsel or your arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. I have the same message for you. I have the same message for everyone in the law enforcement, in government. If this is who you are, if this is you that you love wealth better than liberty, or you love the tranquility, the peace of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, then go home from us in peace. We don't ask for your counsel, and we don't want your arms. Crouch down and lick the hands that feed you. Your chains may they set upon you lightly, and go home from us, and may posterity forget that you were one of us, that you were one of our countrymen. Those are powerful words. And those of you who are in a position, who work in government, who work in law enforcement, who work for the federal government, state governments, administrative agencies, if you love wealth better than liberty, if you love the tranquility of servitude better than the animating cost of freedom, go home from us in peace. We don't want your counsels or your arms. Crouch down and continue to lick the hands that feed you. And may your chains rest lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you were our countrymen. The final thought I'll leave you with is another quote from another great man, far more wise, far more intelligent, far more learned than I. In the beginning of a change, the patriot is a scarce man, brave, hated, and scorned. But when his cause succeeds, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot. Mark Twain. So stand, America. Choose, America. Freedom and liberty, or tyranny and death. Arise and be counted. Today, now. Be fearless and be fierce, and be courageous in your convictions, in your knowledge, and in your beliefs. And speak out, even when your voice quakes. You've been listening to America's Voice Now. Please, America, recognize where we are. Our nation is in dire trouble, and we need every one of you on board. Be fearless. Don't be reckless, but be fearless. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org, facebook.com/America's Voice Now. Find this and every other program that we do up on YouTube. You can get there by going to youtube.com/America's Voice Now. Share it with your friends. Email me about this or any other segment that's made an impact on you, for or against, to mike@americasvoicenow.org. That's mike@americasvoicenow.org. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow morning.